V Brano prihajajo sodnice in sodniki Ustavnega sodišča Republike Slovenije. Spoštovani, v Brano prihaja gospod Borut Pahor, predsednik Republike Slovenije.
Spoštovani vodje poslanskih skupin, spoštovani gospod Načkov, Škof in drugi predstavniki, visoki predstavniki verskih skupnosti, spoštovani nekdanji predsedniki, podpredsedniki in sodniki Ustavnega sodišča, spoštovani drugi visoki gostje. V Veliko čast in veselje mi je, da vas lahko tudi letos v imenu Ustavnega sodišča Republike Slovenije pozdravim na svečanosti, s katero obeležujemo 23. december, dan, ko je bila leta 1991 razglašena in uveljavljena ustava. S tradicionalno slovesnostjo opozarjamo na pomen njenega spoštovanja in uresničevanja v njej vsebovanih vrednot. Najpomembnejše med njimi so gotovo človekove pravice in temeljne svoboščine. Pomembno pa je tudi, da oblastni organi delujejo po načelih pravne in socialne države ter načelu delitve oblasti. V skladu z njim imamo 3 enakovredne in med seboj prirejene veje oblasti, kot je v svoji odločitvi poudarilo Ustavno sodišče. Vse so zavezane ravnati po ustavi. Vsaka od veje oblasti mora odgovorno izpolnjevati svoje ustavne pristojnosti. Za uresničevanje tega morajo med drugim institucije in nosilci oblastnih funkcij ravnati na temelju medsebojnega spoštovanja. Slovenska ustava je izrazito odprta do mednarodnega prava. Njegova načela in pravila, uveljavljena v mednarodnih instrumentih, še posebno tistih o človekovih pravicah, dejansko temeljijo na vrednotah, enakim vrednotam, podkanim v ustavo. Na podlagi tako imenovanega evropskega člena je ustava odprta tudi do prava mednarodne organizacije, v katero smo vstopili leta 2004, trdno prepričani, da deluje in bo delovala na temelju spoštovanja človekovih pravic in temeljnih svoboščin, demokracije in načel pravne države. Evropska unija, zametki katere so bili, kot je lepo rekel profesor Badinter, ustanovljeni v miru in za mir v Evropi. Nosi skupaj z vsemi državami članicami veliko odgovornost, da bo to svoje poslanstvo lahko izpolnjevala tudi za prihodnje rodove Evropejk in Evropejcev. Iskanje prave poti v okoliščinah, v katerih živimo, gotovo ni in ne bo lahko. Zato je še toliko pomembneje, da se vsi nosilci odgovornih funkcij v državah članicah in institucijah Evropske unije premorejo dovolj pripravljenosti in modrosti za graditev naše skupne politične in pravne prihodnosti. Ob hkratnem spoštovanju raznolikosti nacionalnih identitet, ki bogatijo skupnost evropskih držav. Letos smo obeležili 60 let od podpisa ustanovnih pogodb. Voditelji držav članic na srečanju v Rimu. Predsedniki sodišč na povabilo predsednika dr. Kuna Lenarca na delovnem srečanju v Luksemburgu. V teh letih je bila prehojena dolga pot oblikovanja Evropske unije v zvezo, kakršno poznamo danes. Pri tem je imelo ves čas izjemno pomembno vlogo sodišče Evropske unije, ki je s svojimi odločitvami tlakovalo temelje Lizbonske pogodbe, vključno z vsemi temeljnimi načeli prava Evropske unije in listino temeljnih, torej človekovih pravic. Spoštovane gospe in gospodje, zato mi je v veliko čast in veselje, da lahko danes povabim k slavnostnemu govoru dr. Kuna Lenarca, predsednika sodišča Evropske unije. Esteemed Professor Lenarc, President of the European Court of Justice, I'm honored and delighted to invite you to address the audience at this solemn occasion.
President of the Republic, Prime Minister, Ministers, Excellencies, Madam President of this Constitutional Court, dear colleagues, and for many of you friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to deliver this keynote speech on the occasion of the Constitutionality Day ceremony of the Republic of Slovenia. I am particularly pleased to be here today in order to commemorate the historic milestone that this country reached when its first constitution as an independent state was adopted on the 23rd of December 1991. The importance of that event cannot be overstated, and it is a true pleasure for me to mark its 26th anniversary with you, not only as President of the Court of Justice of the European Union, but also, first and foremost, as a constitutional and international lawyer deeply committed to democracy, justice, and the rule of law. In the course of this speech, I would like to explore with you various aspects of the dynamic relationship between national constitutions and constitutionalism on the one hand, and European Union law on the other. The starting point of my reasoning is simple. National constitutions are fundamental and indeed indispensable in a union between states. Constitutional rules of the member states are obviously relevant at the foundational stage of the European Union, since the European Union's very existence stems from an international agreement between, I quote, high contracting parties. Thus, under Articles 54 of the Treaty on European Union and 357 on the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the Member States' consent to be bound by the treaties is dependent upon ratification, and I quote the treaties themselves, in accordance with their respective constitutional requirements. The same condition applies to all treaty amendments. But of course, the role of national constitutions in EU law clearly does not stop at this foundational stage. As I shall illustrate with examples from the treaties and the case law, it is flawed, it's wrong to oppose national constitutionalism to the emergence and development of the European Union legal and even constitutional order. The reality is quite different. National constitutions and the EU legal order complement one another, and they are therefore perfectly, although not unconditionally, capable of coexistence and harmonious development. According to Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union, I quote, "The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights." Significantly, that provision further specifies that, and I quote again, "these values are common to the member states." As I see it, that is an implicit, although unmistakable reference to the constitutional traditions of the member states. Thus, whilst the member states' constitutions vary in many respects, including on such essential issue as the form of government, some member states have a constitutional monarchy, others, like this one, are a republic. One can nevertheless safely assume that all member states share these common values just enumerated, that make political and legal integration on the European continent possible. It is clear from that Article 2 TEU that the European Union is firmly rooted in those constitutional traditions that are common to its member states. The common values to which Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union refers are paramount to defining what I often describe as the EU's functional constitution. That is to say, a union building upon democracy, justice and rights. It is against that functional constitutional background that the Court of Justice of the European Union made clear in its landmark CADI 1 judgment that even the duty of the member states to implement United Nations Security Council resolutions may not justify derogating in an EU act, I quote, from the principles of liberty, democracy and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms enshrined in what is now Article 2 TEU as a foundation of the Union. Article 13 TEU now expressly requires the Union's institutions, inter alia, I quote, to promote the Union's values, mutual trust between the member states, underpinning the very existence of the Union, is supplemented by their trust that powers transferred to the European Union will be exercised in full compliance with their common constitutional values. That close nexus between state and EU constitutionalism finds a particularly clear resonance in the so-called Copenhagen criteria, which each state candidate for accession has to meet in order to join the European Union. The national democracy must conform to common European standards, and the level of fundamental rights protection ensured by its public authorities must be compatible with that guaranteed in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which, as we all know, has the same legal force as the treaties themselves. Article 49 of the treaty, the specific provision on accession introduced by the Lisbon Treaty, expressly requires each candidate state to comply with, I quote, the values referred to in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union, and to be committed to promoting them. That requirement aims to ensure that EU enlargement does not jeopardize mutual trust between the member states, mutual trust which is largely dependent on the unconditional commitment of all members of the club to conform to the common values to which I have referred. It therefore comes as no surprise that the constitutional traditions common to the member states have played a significant role in identifying fundamental rights applicable in the EU legal order as general principles of EU law. That process started long before any autonomous catalogue of fundamental rights came into existence at EU level. For example, in the 1986 Johnson case concerning sex discrimination as regards employment in the police forces of Northern Ireland, the Court of Justice made clear that the requirement of effective judicial control reflects a general principle of law which underlies the constitutional traditions common to the member states. So a lady, having been refused access to the police force and had no apparent judicial remedy against that decision, our court, the predecessors, 30 years ago said that it was a constitutional tradition common to the member states to have access to a court, to have judicial review carried out against that decision. The fact that member states' constitutional traditions should inspire the European Union institutions when defining the substance of EU fundamental rights is now expressly confirmed in Article 6, third paragraph of the TEU, and reaffirmed in the preamble to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. In other cases, fundamental rights resulting from the constitutional traditions common to the member states have been successfully raised by member states to justify restrictions to free movement. So normally restrictions to free movement are forbidden. Exceptionally, they can be justified. Such justification can rely on the fundamental rights protection, fundamental right common to the member states. An illustration is the famous Schmidberger case, in which the Court of Justice had to deal with a restriction to free movement of goods that resulted from a demonstration by environmental protesters blocking access for a period of 28 hours to the Brenner motorway connecting Innsbruck in Austria to northern Italy. Schmidberger, an international transport company based in Germany, sought compensation from Austria for the damage which it claimed to have suffered as a result of that country's decision to authorize a demonstration. To be slightly more direct on this, it's quite simple. The German transporter had promised a delivery of goods just in time and was under heavy contractual penalties for any delay incurred. He's blocked with a lorry on the Brenner Pass, and the Austrian says, yes, but we can't do anything about it because they're environmental protesters. They have the right to protest. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly in a peaceful way, etc. So you see the point. So they bring an action for damages against Austria to recuperate the contractual damages they had to pay to their customer in Italy. So it's all very concrete. And what now to do? Well, the Austrian authorities argued, in essence, that banning the demonstration and thus avoiding the likely restriction of free movement would have been incompatible with the freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly guaranteed by the Austrian Constitution and by the European Convention on Human Rights. This case placed before the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union had entered into force. The Court of Justice held, that these fundamental rights belonged, I quote, to the constitutional traditions common to the member states, and that protecting them was therefore legitimate. Subject to a balancing of interest, it could be brought in proportion with the restriction of the freedom of movement. As it turned out, the court ruled in favor of Austria, saying that here, for a pre-announced demonstration limited to 28 hours, the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to protest prevailed over the free movement of goods for that short period. So the balancing came out against Schmidberger, who possibly had to sustain itself the damages in Italian court. But that depends on the private law of contract. But in any event, they couldn't recuperate anything against Austria. So I think it's a clear acknowledgement of the role of the constitutional traditions common to the member states. Nowadays, the clearest acknowledgement of member states' constitutionalism in European Union primary law is, of course, Article 4, second paragraph of the Treaty on European Union, which states that the Union, I quote, shall respect the equality of member states before the treaties, as well as their national identities, inherent in their fundamental structures, political and constitutional, inclusive of regional and local self-government. A first obvious consequence is that EU law does not, and indeed may not, call into question the institutional architecture and structures of governance resulting from each member state's constitutional order. For instance, in the 2014 Digibet and Albers case concerning disparities in the conditions for providing betting and gaming services between the various Länder, that is the component entities of the German Bund in Germany, the Court of Justice held that freedom to provide such services, which is guaranteed under Article 56 TFEU, should not apply without due consideration for the division of competences between those Länder, that is to say, without respecting the federal structure of the Federal Republic of Germany. Therefore, the court ruled that those disparities between the Länder did not render the restrictions on betting and gaming services in Germany incoherent. You should know that in free movement law, when a member state invokes a general interest, then one of the requirements of our case law to see whether the invocation of that general interest is genuine is to say, are you really pursuing that general interest objective consistently? Or do you do it with some incoherencies, inconsistencies, so that it is not very credible as a pretext? So here, the Commission said, yes, but some Bundesländer restrict and other Bundesländer in Germany don't restrict. That's incoherent. So in a fundamental judgment, our court said to the Commission, no, that's not incoherent. This is the consequence of German federalism, that the Bundesländer have the right to decide each one for itself. That's a marvelous case of application, I say also for the academic colleagues here on the bench, of Article 4, paragraph 2. It's respect for the national constitutional identity of the member states, perfectly compatible with European Union law. Constitutional or national identity has furthermore been regarded as a possible justification for restrictions on the free movement of persons. Comes to mind, of course, the Sayn-Wittgenstein case of 2010. The Verwaltungsgerichtshof, Supreme Administrative Court in Austria, sought guidance from the Court of Justice on whether free movement rights benefiting EU citizens under Article 21 TEVU precluded a constitutional law in Austria abolishing the nobility and titles of nobility from applying to an Austrian citizen who had acquired the title of Fürstin, princess, by adoption in another member state, Germany, and was living there. Ms. Sayn-Wittgenstein argued in essence that losing that title in Austria when she moved back from Germany to Austria would mean that her name in official documents delivered in Austria would differ from that appearing in official documents delivered in Germany. In her view, it followed from earlier case law of the court, for the specialist, I quote, Grünkin-Paul case of 2008, that such disparities gave rise to serious inconvenience that restricted her freedom of movement. The Austrian authorities countered that such a restriction, even assuming it to be established, would be justified in any event by the republican and egalitarian values underlying the law abolishing nobility in that country, regarded as fundamental in the Austrian legal order. The Court of Justice held that whilst applying the constitutional law at issue to the situation of Ms. Sayn-Wittgenstein, interfered with her right to freely move within the EU, so the court said yes, there is some inconvenience for her, because she will go under two different names. That restriction is totally justified. So here again, the court ruled in favor of Austria. It recalled an earlier statement in the Omega Spielhalle case, a German case concerning a laser game simulating the killing of human beings, stating that whilst public policy may be relied on by a member state only if there is a genuine and sufficiently serious threat to a fundamental interest of society, the restrictive measure at issue must not necessarily correspond to a conception that is shared by all the member states as regards the way in which that interest is to be secured. In its reasoning upholding Austria's line of argument, the Court of Justice expressly referred to Article 4, second paragraph of the Treaty on European Union and to the ensuing principle that the Union must respect the status of Austria as a republic, republican form of government and the clause of the US Constitution. The same here. Now, what it shows is all my emphasis on the constitutional traditions common to the member states may not be misunderstood to the point that it would require that until the last detail of implementation the law is common before our court can recognize it. These cases show it. When in Germany the killing of laser game, killing of persons, I always fail to see how that can be a game in the first place, but I mean apparently it is for some people. So when that is held to be contrary to human dignity in Germany, because they say it lowers the threshold of killing of real people, that's of course an interpretation of human dignity held in Germany, which other member states say, but listen, these are only pictures on a wall. I mean, this is only a game, right? It's not, no single person is being killed. There are even no single real persons in the room when we play that game. And our court said no. We ruled in favor of Germany. Because if they feel that the human dignity, the common constitutional value, which the whole of the European Union recognizes, human dignity, right to life, requires to also forbid that, because in German society this would lead to possible bigger risk for real people being killed, we defer to that choice. The same with Seynt-Wittgenstein. If the republican and egalitarian form of government requires abolition of nobility, it might lead to an inconvenience. There are plenty of other member states having nobility titles, and even, I'm afraid, well placed to know it. The monarchies. But that doesn't matter. Respect for the national identity in such a fundamental matter is taken seriously by our court. And even outside the scope of Article 4, second paragraph TEU, the Court of Justice endeavours to reconcile effective implementation of EU law with respect for the specific scope conferred on a particular fundamental right in a given member state. And I refer here, for those of you who do not yet know it, to the MAS and MB case, referred to commonly as Tarico 2, in which judgment was delivered on the 5th of December 2017, and concerning a rule of Italian criminal law under which the limitation period for an offence could under no circumstances be extended by more than a quarter of its initial duration in case of suspension or interruption, and the possible impact of that rule on the protection through effective, dissuasive and proportionate criminal sanctions of the Union's financial interests in case of serious fraud related to value-added tax, which, as we know, is one of the European Union's own resources. Given the complexity and duration of criminal proceedings in respect of serious fraud in relation to value-added tax, the question arose whether that absolute limit on the applicable limitation period created de facto impunity for such fraud, and therefore entailed the risk of financial losses for the European Union. In the original Tarico judgment of 2015, the Court of Justice held that such impunity, assuming it were to be established by the national courts, would justify setting aside the rule in question, that is the rule limiting strictly the limitation of the period, on the basis that it was contrary to Article 325 TFEU, which requires the member states to counter fraud and other illegal activities affecting the financial interests of the EU. In its request for a preliminary ruling in the MAS and MB case, the Italian Constitutional Court, so your direct colleagues in Rome, Corte Costituzionale, sought additional guidance from the Court of Justice, starting out from this initial Tarico judgment. That court uttered doubts whether EU law should entail such an exclusionary effect of this limitation of the limitation period, even where that effect risked creating a conflict with the principle of the legality of criminal proceedings guaranteed by Article 25 of the Italian Constitution. The Corte Costituzionale emphasized in its reference that a key feature of the Italian legal order is that limitation periods form part of substantive criminal law, unlike the position in many other member states, where limitation periods are seen as a matter of procedural criminal law. We had our research department make a comparative legal study, which will be published on the website of our network, by the way, under the new regime. and we found that the member states are divided. In some member states, the limitation period in criminal cases is substantive criminal law, in other member states it's procedural. And it has, of course, consequences, because if it's a substantive criminal law rule, like Article 25 of the Italian Constitution, like interpreted by the Corte Costituzionale, such rules should necessarily benefit the defendant insofar as they were part of the law applicable to them when the offence was committed. In its preliminary ruling, the Court of Justice repeated that member states are under a duty to ensure that limitation periods do not compromise effective prosecution of fraud related to value advertising. However, the Court adds, in the absence of harmonization at EU level concerning limitation periods for such offences, Italy was free to consider that such rules formed part of substantive criminal law. So we deferred to national diversity in the absence of harmonization at EU level. Then our court went on to emphasize that the principle of the legality of criminal proceedings is now guaranteed in EU law, Article 49 of the Charter, and forms part, again, of the constitutional traditions common to the member states. It then expressly acknowledges the specific scope of that principle in Italy, covering rules on limitation periods, and therefore accepted that compliance with that principle could result in national courts considering proceedings to be time-barred, even when that might undermine effective prosecution of fraud related to VAT. In such a case, it will be for the national legislature to adopt new rules governing the application of limitation periods, allowing for the effective prosecution of such fraud. Thereby, the Court of Justice, in fact, had due regard to the trias politica, separation of powers in the member states. So we basically said to the Italian courts, if you feel you can't set aside this shortening of the extension of limitation period after interruption of the limitation period, then you should not do it, because if you feel this is contrary to Article 25 of the Constitution, but then your legislator should act to provide for limitation periods long enough to have effective prosecution, criminal prosecution of serious fraud of VAT. And that's very important because there our court shows sensitivity, again, for the constitutional structure of the member state, hinging on the trias politica. So I think that is a very important judgment. That legal and by implication constitutional traditions in the various member states are not ignored by the Court of Justice and may even contribute to shaping the EU legal order itself is moreover reflected in that court's internal workings. In accordance with Article 19, paragraph 2 TEU, the Court of Justice is composed of one judge per member state, assisted by advocates general, which means that the court has available to it, in particular at the stage when each case is initially analyzed by the general meeting, before being attributed to a chamber, expertise relating to each member state's legal system. The court is also, as I said, assisted by its Directorate of Research and Documentation, whose tasks include preparing research notes, examining how specific legal issues, including of a constitutional nature, are dealt with in some or even in all of our member states. With that said, constitutional or national identity is necessarily limited to a subset of constitutional law and practice of each member state. In other words, constitutional rules of a member state may only exceptionally form a legitimate obstacle to the full application of EU law, as any other approach would seriously undermine the effectiveness of EU law and call into question the equality of member states before EU law. The exceptional nature of constitutional justification in EU law is closely related to the principle in the first sentence of Article 4, paragraph 2, that all member states are equal before the treaties. And so that is why when our court allows for room for diversity, constitutional diversity in the member states, it's either in cases where it's a common constitutional tradition which get a specific filling in a member state, very genuinely and in an unprotectionist way pursued, then this is validated, even if it's a relatively small, mostly obstacle to free movement, or to another principle. However, to put it relatively bluntly and not to be misunderstood, it would not suffice for a member state, when it is opposed to a political proposal in Brussels from the Commission, to quickly insert a rule in its constitution, opposing that rule proposed, and say now, it's in my constitution, constitutional identity. I say it slightly directly now, but that's exactly what we mean. So we have a very subtle balance. I said it last year in Bled on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of this court, that equality between member states would be undermined if each member state could refuse to execute the European arrest warrant on the ground that its constitutional standards were higher than those of the issuing member state. That would have the undesirable consequence that the binding effect of the framework decision on the European arrest warrant on each member state would vary in intensity depending on its constitutional rules and practices. For similar reasons, the Court of Justice has had to safeguard on several occasions the effectiveness of EU law from procedural interference, which would otherwise have resulted from constitutional rules and practices. I'm referring to the old Simmental case, 40 years old, where the court said that an ordinary court must, in principle, itself be able to draw the consequences from a ruling of our court without having to first appeal to the Constitutional Court to have that court invalidate the law in conflict with EU law. You know this. That's a good example of where a constitutional procedural provision could not stand in the way to the primacy, the effectiveness, and the equal application of union law in that member state. And that is why the court held in its landmark judgment Internationale Handelsgesellschaft that the validity of an EU measure, in that case agricultural measures relating to cereals, can never be measured directly against the constitution of a member state. The standard of constitutional review of EU acts and measures is only EU law itself. That is the primary law of the Union, the general principles of Union law based on the constitutional traditions common to the member states, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, to the same effect. That brings me to the Court of Justice's functional involvement in constitutional reasoning sensu stricto, when it rules on the validity of EU secondary law. You know the famous landmark judgment in Le Ver. That's a judgment in which I was operational way back in 1986 when I was a referent there at the court. Paragraph 23 of that judgment, of which all the judges still remain proud today, says that the European Economic Community, I would now say European Union, is a union based on the rule of law. That's the first time that that sentence figures in any judgment of the Court of Justice, 1986. Based on the rule of law, inasmuch as neither its member states nor its institutions can avoid a review of the question whether the measures adopted by them are in conformity with the basic constitutional charter of the treaty. It is the mission of the court, our court, to ensure that the law is observed, That is the wording of Article 19, first paragraph TEU. And that is not limited to verifying that the member states comply with union law. It is also, and I would almost say first and foremost, a responsibility to verify that the institutions, bodies and agencies of the Union comply with the constitutional block that is the treaties and the charter. And that is, of course, a responsibility shared by the two courts composing our institution, the General Court and the Court of Justice. Now, several preliminary rulings, that is, rulings brought to us by national courts, that is, requests for rulings brought by national courts, illustrate the Court of Justice's unequivocal commitment to upholding the constitutional values common to the member states. I already spoke informally with President Sovdat about the digital rights and Zeitlinger case, and that's a very beautiful example. You have in 2006 the metadata of electronic communications directive, that is the data retention directive, very well known also in the bench of this court. All the member states need to adopt legislation to implement that directive in their national legal order. But they do it through laws, also in Belgium, the member state where I'm coming from. And since that is a law, it can of course be presented by way of actions for annulment or otherwise, depending on the national procedures, to the Constitutional Court. Because it's a law. And that Constitutional Court says, yes, but that law is the mechanical transposition of a directive into the domestic legal order. If there is something wrong with that law in view of our Constitution, there might also be something wrong upstream with the directive in comparison to the primary law of the European Union itself. And that was exactly the decision of the Constitutional Court of Austria, under the able presidency already of Gerhard Holzinger. And so they referred the matter to our court by way of a request for checking the validity of the directive of 2006 with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And let me tell you very directly, when a national constitutional court asks a question to the Court of Justice, and very fortunately enough, this is not like a student asking a question to a professor. I insist, this is not like a student asking a professor, right? We are colleagues of equal learning, of equal rank, dialoguing with one another as equals and as learned jurists. So the Austrian Constitutional Court spelled out its whole reasoning, making it utterly clear that in the eyes of their constitution, this was unlawful, unconstitutional. And that judgment is thereafter translated to all 23 other languages of the Union, notified to all the member states in their language. That's Europe. It's a networking exercise. They all took position vis-à-vis the substantive reasoning of the Austrian Constitutional Court. That's why they did it in the first place. To make a substantive dialogue with their judgment possible as the real debate before the Court of Justice. We had a parallel case from the High Court in Dublin, which did more or less the same from an Irish perspective, common law. We joined all of that, and after a marvelous debate, pan-European debate, with all quarters of Europe being represented in our docket, we had written and oral submissions. We came out the way we came out, and you know it, we invalidated the directive. That is a real Constitutional Court judgment. We have many cases also where we are doing what the United States Supreme Court does, that is the horizontal and vertical division of competences between the Union institutions, between the Union and the Member States. I have only to refer in tribute to my colleague, President of Chamber Marko Ilicic, the biggest gift Slovenia has done to our court, and I really want to stress that. He was the reporting judge in the opinion on the trade and investment agreement between the European Union and Singapore, but it stands model for all the now pending agreements like CETA, TTIP, the now negotiated deals with Japan, Australia, Vietnam, etc. That is, what are the competences of the Union, what are the competences of the Member States. So that's really constitutional work, and there we draw, of course, on the literature on comparative constitutional law, especially in that case on of the federal Member States. Lastly, we also are involved in our constitutional law jurisprudence in what I would call the crisis fields of Europe. We had the banking and the financial crisis, and we dialogued with the court hosting us here today in the Kotnik case. An excellent reference, marvelously drafted, here again translated to all the languages of the European Union, pan-European dialogue. We came out the way we did, and the President assured me that the follow-up decision in line with our judgment is taken, and the judgment stands out now as the standard equality of all the Member States in all of our Member States. That's for the banking and financial crisis by way of an example. We also have, of course, the Eurozone crisis cases, with the famous Pringle case, where we had to rule on the constitutionality of the European Stability Mechanism, which is the precursor of the European Monetary Fund, which is now in the process of being established as a union law deepening of the Intergovernmental European Stability Mechanism. Our judgment in the Pringle case contains all the legal aspects which are relevant to that transformation of the European Stability Mechanism, to which Slovenia as a Euro member state is a party, towards an EU monetary fund. That's the Pringle case. And of course, in dialogue with the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the Constitutional Court in Germany, we are specifying the competences of the European Central Bank. I'm referring to the Open Market Outright Monetary Transactions Program, the OMT program in the Gauweiler case, and last August we got a follow-up case, the Weiss case, further specifying whether the quantitative easing program, asking to further specify whether the quantitative easing program of the European Central Bank, presently in operation, that's different from the outright monetary transactions program, which was only announced but never put into effect. The quantitative easing program has already run, I'm afraid to say, for 2,000 billion euros. So it's an enormous program. And the legality of that is now being questioned through that further reference of the Bundesverfassungsgericht. So you see there, we play our role as a constitutional court when we are asked to do so. There also we draw on the national constitutional traditions. It will not have escaped you that a lot of these judgments, and I have only taken a handful of illustrations, they have been rendered, they have been delivered by our court on request of national constitutional courts. I could add the Meloni case, for instance, which was a reference for the Spanish Constitutional Court, balancing the mutual recognition in the European arrest warrant with the rights of defense for a person convicted in absentia. And these judgments are really the product of a constructive dialogue between national constitutional courts and our court. One thing is certain. The role of our court, unifying the law for the European Union in order to guarantee the equality between member states and their citizens, upholding the constitutionality of union law in line with the constitutional traditions common to the member states. It is a network exercise. We need good references. They allow us to have good judicial debates. Good references and high quality references, high quality debates in our court, in writing and orally, involving the whole of Europe. They legitimize, hopefully, high quality, cogently reasoned, collegiate judgments. Collegiate because that's the rule of play which the member states gave to our court, and in a composite legal order that's probably inevitable. For that reason, our court, on the occasion of the 60th anniversary, and President Sovdat has in her introduction referred to it, we decided to link all our courts, the constitutional courts, the supreme courts of the member states, through an interactive internet platform to our court, to exchange on a day-to-day basis our case law, our research notes, everything. And this in the 24 languages. In order to involve everything, our Court of Justice is really our Court of Justice. It's a Slovenian court, it's a Bulgarian court, it's a Flemish court, it's a Danish court, it's a Portuguese court, it's a court common to all of us. For those matters which we have decided, by way of good governance decision, to do in common. Clean water, clean air, sustainable energy supply, nothing of all of that stops at state borders. Criminals fleeing over internal frontiers within the open space called Schengen, it's a common concern. I see the Minister of Justice, judicial cooperation in civil matters, commercial matters, criminal matters, police cooperation, asylum and immigration. There is no alternative. We do all of this in common. Our court is there to see to it that there is uniform interpretation, application and enforcement, guaranteeing equality between all member states and their citizens, and that the policy choices are made in compliance with the constitutional values common to the member states. In that enterprise, we are together. As I always say, and I really mean it in the deepest of my conviction, we are together in this. And that is why I'm so happy to have been given the opportunity to share this conviction with you, that we are forming a composite constitutional order in which the constitutional courts and our court form a single network of upholding democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights. I'm very proud of having been here on Slovenian Constitutionality Day. I wish you to celebrate that day for many, many more years and decades to come. Europe needs you. Thank you very much.
Letošnjo pomlad se je iztekel mandat ustavni sodnici in 3 ustavnim sodnikom, ki so svojo funkcijo začeli opravljati leta 2008. V imenu Ustavnega sodišča Republike Slovenije se jim zahvaljujem za opravljeno poslanstvo pri varovanju ustave. Obvestiti vas moram, da se nekdanji predsednik Ustavnega sodišča, profesor dr. Ernest Petrič, ni mogel udeležiti današnje slovesnosti. Nekoliko ga je izdalo zdravje, zaželimo mu čimprejšnje okrevanje. Plaketo, ki jo podeljuje Ustavno sodišče nekdanjim ustavnim sodnikom, mu bomo sodniki podelili po novem letu v ožjem krogu. Zato pa prosim dr. Sebastjana Nerada, generalnega sekretarja Ustavnega sodišča, da izroči plaketo s priznanjem Ustavnega sodišča ustavnemu sodniku dr. Niki Reisenbergu. Janu Zavcu. Hvala lepa, spoštovana kolegica, spoštovana kolega, želite kratko nagovoriti na slavnostni zbor? Sodnik dr. Mitja Dajzner, prosim.
Spoštovani visoki gostje, gospe in gospodje, kolegice in kolegi, rad bi se za ta priznanja zahvalil v imenu vseh treh, po oblastilu profesor Petriča tudi v njegovem imenu, ki je sedaj. No, minil je 9-letni mandat sodnici in sodnikom in to se izgleda kot dolg mandat. V resnici pa sedaj vidimo, da je izjemno hitromljiv. Moram reči, da pri sprejemu funkcije ustavnega sodnika in pri opravljanju te funkcije smo ravnali odgovorno, zavzeto, skrbno, strokovnim znanjem. Odločitve ustavnega sodišča so izjemno transparentne, nihče se ne more skriti, kajti v odločbah je točno navedeno, kako je posamezni sodnik glasoval. Še bolj je jasno, če napiše pritrdilno ali odklonilno odločeno mnenje. No, pri svojih odločitvah bi rekel, da je treba pač razlagati ustavo, ko gre za kršitev človekovih pravic in temeljnih svoboščin, pa naj bo to recimo enakost pred zakonom, načelo zakonitosti, svobodna gospodarska pobuda, pravica do svobodnega izražanja in številne druge pravice in svoboščine, izhajati iz tega, da v takšnih rešitvah je tkano v samo ustavo tudi načelo pravičnosti. Pred seboj imajo ustavne sodnice in sodniki 9 spise z mnogimi list, ampak za temi spisi stoji konkreten človek, skupina ljudi, skupina državljanov in to je treba imeti pred seboj, ko se naroča. Ne more biti ustava koncipirana tem, da iz njihovih odločb lahko pride do krivične odločitve. Jasno, da to mora biti upoštevano. No, ko smo stopili z novo ustavo, ki je rdeča nit pravzaprav naše države, ko smo sprejeli demokratični politični sistem, svobodno tržno gospodarstvo, je tkano vse to tudi v odločitvah ustavnega sodišča. Ustavno sodišče je neodvisno sodišče in odločbe ustavnega sodišča so obvezne. Zato jih pač morajo vsi spoštovati, tako posameznik, lokalna skupnost in tudi država. S tem in spoštovanjem teh odločb bomo pač v naši državi lahko dosegli res pravno državo in spoštovanje ustavnosti. No, za zaključek bi povedal, da s takšno mislijo sem prepričan, da tudi nova sestava ustavnega sodišča nadaljevala to delo, izkoristim pa to priložnost, da vsem ob tej priliki zaželim prijetne božične praznike in srečno malo.
Hvala kolegi dr. Mitji Dajznerju za te lepe misli, pomembne, s katerimi se lahko samo strinjamo. Spoštovani, Amatijeva violina, na katero je igral Giuseppe Tartini, lahko zapusti mesto v Tartinijevi rastni hiši, v kateri domuje le v spremstvu kustosinje za umetnostno zgodovino Pomorskega muzeja Serpe in Mašera v Piranu. Zahvaljujem se gospe Duški Žitko, da jo je danes za nas pospremila do Plečnikove palače. Prisluhnili smo njenemu zvenu ob himnah, ki jih je zaigral violinist gospod Zdravko Veše. Prisluhnemo še sonati Giuseppeja Tartinija Vražji trilček. Skladbo naj bi Tartini najprej slišal v svojih sanjah. V notnem zapisu pa se naj ne bi uspel polno približati, zato naj bi Radio Viri svojo jezo stresel nad violino. Kdo ve, morda pa ta žlahtni glasbeni inštrument potrebuje le pravega mojstra, ki iz nje zna izvabiti tisto sansko glasbo. Prisluhnimo Tartinijevi violini in mojstru Zlatku Dešetu, prosim. se vam zahvaljujem, da ste se odzvali v miru in skupaj z nami počastili dan ustavnosti. Želim vam vesele praznike. V letu, ki prihaja, pa sreče, zdravja in medsebojnega spoštovanja. Podarjajte vse leto dobroto ljudem, da jih boste tudi sami obilo deležni. Dobrote in nikoli preveč. Vabim vas, da naše druženje nadaljujemo v soboto.
Obletnici kot je, ali pa ob dnevu, kot je dan ustavnosti, kaj lahko poveste o trenutnem dogajanju v Sloveniji, predvsem pa o spoštovanju ustave in o luči te razglasitve samostojnosti, kje smo danes?
Mislim, da smo prišli v položaj, ko bo treba razmisliti o bolj celovitem pogledu na ustavo in o nekaterih reformnih posegih. Očitno je, da pri nas izvršna oblast ne funkcionira najbolje, da imamo težave pri sestavljanju vlade, pri oblikovanju odgovornosti ministrov, preveliko je število interpelacij in podobne zadeve. Skratka, mislim, da bi ta aspekt ustave zaslužil temeljito preučitev in tudi kakšno spremembo. Da bi lahko tudi spremenili položaj predsednika republike, mogoče bi ga lahko volili v parlamentu. Skratka, cela vrsta vprašanje, ki jih je čas prinesel in verjamem, da bi zdaj že lahko začeli razmišljati o bolj celovitem pogledu, mogoče tudi kakšni ustavni reformi.
To je en vidik, torej izvrševanje ustave, kaj pa ustavni duh na splošno? Ali je slovenska ustava še dovolj moderna za ta čas, v katerem živimo, dovolj dobro funkcionira, da Sloveniji lahko zagotavlja neko enakovreden položaj, predvsem v Evropski uniji, pa tudi širše v mednarodni skupnosti? Torej,
osnovna načela, pravila slovenske ustave, človekove pravice so zelo dobro zastavljene in tu ni nobene potrebe po reformah. Tukaj je stvar interpretacij vseh organov, ki izvajajo ustavo in seveda zlasti ustavnega sodišča, da zagotovijo sodobno, funkcionalno in v vsakem pogledu ustrezno razlago teh temeljnih norm. To se nanaša seveda zlasti na poglavje o človekovih pravicah. Tisto, kjer je treba kaj pogledati in spremeniti, je struktura in funkcioniranje oblastnih organov. In tam verjamem, da bi bilo dobro narediti en boljši pogled, pogledati, kaj se je v praksi pokazalo kot problematično. Marsikaj od tega vemo recimo za volitve, za oblikovanje vlade, za tovrstne zadeve in tu verjamem, da bo sprememba potrebna.
Hvala lepa. Dr. Šulk, a lahko še eno vprašanje za kolegico? Kaj bi želeli sebi in vsem državljanom Slovenije za novo leto ali v novem letu?
Torej, seveda, kot je navada, se ljudem zaželi zdravja in sreče in dobrih dejanj, ki naj jih dajejo sami drugim in prejemajo drugi. Kaj več pa je seveda stvar vsakega posameznika.
Hvala, srečno zadeva. Vi ste sodelovali pri njenem nastanku, ne? Ali je še dovolj aktualna, dovolj moderna za učinkovito funkcioniranje države?
Slovenska ustava je zagotovo še vedno zelo primeren ustavno-pravni okvir za delovanje države. Seveda so v ustavi nekatere rešitve, ki bi bilo mogoče tudi spremeniti tako, da bi lahko država in družba še učinkoviteje funkcionirala, da se pa seveda tudi z ustrezno pravno prakso in drugimi prijemi v okviru ustavnih določb povsem dobro, bi rekel, peljati to državo naprej in predvsem, kar je najpomembnejše, varovati svoboščine, pravice naših državljanov.
No, saj to, zdi se, da prepogosto se računa samo na ustavno sodišče kot tisto, ki bo varovalo ustavne vrednote. Vsi ostali, od recimo izvršne oblasti, zakonodajne oblasti, tudi rednih sodišč, pa se premalo ozirajo na to.
Dejstvo je, da ustavnost ali pa vladavina prava kot širši pojem je nekaj, kar se mora preliti v zavest državljanov in seveda vseh, še posebej, ki delajo v državnih institucijah. Ustava ni zgolj samo, bi rekel, neka oblika, neka črka na papirju, to je nekaj živega in če bomo v naši družbi bolje ponotranjili ustavne vrednote in seveda tudi tiste, ki jih potem določamo zakoni, potem bo ta družba delovala bolje, še posebej, če ne bomo prava uporabljali predvsem zato, da pravzaprav preprečujemo neke pozitivne družbene procese, ampak bomo pravo videli predvsem kot mehanizem, ki lahko spodbuja družbeni razvoj in pa predvsem, seveda, kot sem rekel, varuje človekove pravice in svoboščine.
Ja. So ga že vprašali, ampak pa me sprašuje, kaj želite vsem sebi in drugim za novo leto?
Za božične praznike želim vsem ljudem, da se umirijo, da najdejo ta mir v sebi in da so skupaj s svojimi najbližjimi. Za novo leto pa želim vsem Slovenkam in Slovencem veliko uspeha pri vsem, kar pravzaprav počnejo, da bi se jim izpolnilo čim več dobrih želja in da bi vsi skupaj znali še bolje sodelovati in delati dobre stvari za našo državo in družbo. Hvala lepa. Lepo se imejte.
Enako. Jaz bi vas rada vprašala ob tem dnevu ustavnosti. Kako gledate na slovensko ustavo po vsem tem času, je dovolj moderna, da lahko Slovenija ostaja moderna država in da pravo predvsem lahko funkcionira tudi na podlagi ustave?
Ja, dan ustavnosti je pravi trenutek za razmislek o tem, kako spoštovati ustavo oziroma obnoviti spoznanje, da jo je treba spoštovati. Slovenska ustava je nastala razmeroma hitro, ni vedno tako, da ustave nastanejo hitro, pa vendar se vidi v današnji praksi, kolikor lahko jaz ocenjujem, ki seveda nimam neposredno opravka z razlago slovenske ustave, funkcionira dobro. Da so pa v ustavi, tako kot naprimer tudi v pogodbah Evropske unije, ki jih bolj poznam, določbe, ki jih je včasih treba razložiti s precej inovativnosti, upoštevajoč različne okoliščine, je pa jasno. In tako da gotovo ima Ustavno sodišče Slovenije veliko in pomembno vlogo, ko razlaga včasih preveč splošne, pa ne bom rekel preveč, ampak zelo splošne določbe v ustavi, ampak to je usoda vsake ustave na svetu.
Ja, sej to je to, ne. Ustava ne sme biti tako konkretna kot zakon, ampak mora tiste temeljne pravice zagotavljati.
Glejte, to je že stara fraza, ne, ampak da je treba spremembo ustavo podpisati s tresočo roko, ne, to je že malo obrabljena fraza, to pomeni, hitre spremembe ustave niso nikdar dobre, izjemoma, no se v Sloveniji ob vsej tej poplavi